If you were alive in 1962, you remember where you were when the photographs appeared. Paparazzi had captured Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton on a yacht in the Mediterranean, their bodies pressed together, completely lost in a kiss that wasn't meant for cameras. The images exploded across every newspaper and magazine in the world. Back then, movie stars were supposed to be untouchable, godlike figures who existed in a different moral universe than ordinary people. The studio system had carefully protected that illusion for decades, but Elizabeth and Richard shattered it in a single moment. Your mother probably discussed it in hushed tones with neighbors. Your father might have shaken his head at the breakfast table, muttering about morals and what was wrong with Hollywood these days. The Cleopatra set in Rome had become ground zero for something unprecedented. Two married actors conducting an affair so public, so reckless that even the Vatican felt compelled to issue a statement. The affair nearly destroyed a $40 million film production, created a media frenzy that makes today's celebrity scandals look tame, and proved that sometimes the greatest love stories are also the most destructive. Before we continue with this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you the untold stories of Hollywood's golden age, the scandals, the triumphs, and the human moments behind the legends. Nobody could have predicted that Cleopatra would become the most expensive film ever made, or that its set would witness the scandal that would change Hollywood forever. 20th Century Fox wanted Elizabeth Taylor for the lead role, and Elizabeth, knowing her worth in an industry that had made her famous since childhood, demanded something unprecedented, $1 million. She became the first actor in Hollywood history to command such a salary. The studio agreed because they believed her violet eyes and legendary beauty would guarantee box office gold. The production started in London at Pinewood Studios in September 1960, and almost immediately everything went wrong. British weather proved catastrophic for a film about ancient Egypt. Rain flooded outdoor sets. Elaborate costumes designed for Mediterranean heat looked absurd in gray English drizzle, but weather was the least of their problems. Elizabeth Taylor, exhausted from personal turmoil and a demanding schedule, collapsed on set with pneumonia. What began as a bad cold evolved into a life-threatening crisis. By January 1961, she was dying. Doctors performed an emergency tracheotomy, cutting into her throat to help her breathe. Newspapers around the world prepared obituaries. The woman with the violet eyes, Hollywood's greatest beauty, was on the edge of death at just 29 years old. She survived, but the scar on her throat would remain forever, hidden beneath jewelry and careful camera angles for the rest of her career. The studio faced a devastating choice: abandon the project and lose millions already spent, or start over from scratch. They chose to start over. Director Ruben Mamoulian was fired. The script was completely rewritten. Most importantly, the entire production moved from London to Rome's Cinecittà Studios, where Mediterranean sunshine could finally provide the backdrop ancient Egypt's story deserved. Massive sets were rebuilt at enormous cost. Thousands of costumes were redesigned, and in this chaos of reconstruction and desperation, someone made a casting decision that would change everything. They hired Richard Burton to play Mark Antony. Richard Burton arrived in Rome in January 1962, carrying a reputation that preceded him like thunder before a storm. At 36, he was considered one of the finest Shakespearean actors of his generation, a man whose voice could make poetry sound like intimate conversation. He had worked with the greatest theatrical directors in London and New York, earning critical acclaim for performances that left audiences breathless. But he was also known for something else: his drinking and his pattern of affairs with leading ladies. Burton's reputation in theatrical circles was well established. He would arrive on a production, captivate everyone with his talent and charisma, conduct an intense affair that burned through the filming schedule, and then move on when the cameras stopped rolling. It was almost mechanical in its predictability. When they were introduced on set, Elizabeth made a conscious decision. She would keep her distance. She had been through enough scandals to last several lifetimes. Her marriage to Eddie Fisher, the crooner she had stolen from her best friend Debbie Reynolds 3 years earlier, had made her the most hated woman in America for months. Letters had arrived at her home calling her a homewrecker, a destroyer of families, a woman without morals. Religious groups had organized boycotts of her films. The scandal had eventually faded, but the memory remained sharp and painful. Elizabeth didn't need another public disaster. She planned to treat Richard Burton with professional courtesy and nothing more. But plans dissolve when confronted with reality. One morning, Burton stumbled onto the Cleopatra set, visibly hungover, his face carrying the gray pallor of a man who had spent the previous night drowning in whiskey. His hands trembled as he reached for a coffee cup. The confident, charismatic actor everyone expected was replaced by someone vulnerable and struggling. Elizabeth watched him for a moment, then quietly walked over and steadied his hand, helping him drink without spilling. Their eyes met. Something passed between them in that moment, something neither could name but both recognized instantly. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was recognition. Two people who spent their entire lives performing had found someone who understood that behind every perfect smile was an exhausted human being who just wanted to stop pretending. The chemistry between Elizabeth and Richard on camera was immediate and undeniable. Director Joseph Mankiewicz, who had been hired to rescue the troubled production, noticed it during their first scene together. He watched through the lens as they performed a moment where Cleopatra and Mark Antony meet for the first time, and he realized something extraordinary was happening. They weren't acting anymore. The way Richard touched Elizabeth's face carried an intensity that had nothing to do with the script or the character motivations they had discussed in rehearsal. The way Elizabeth looked at him suggested she had forgotten dozens of crew members were watching. After Mankiewicz called cut, neither actor moved. They stayed locked in position, lost in whatever was happening between them. The crew began to notice. Makeup artists saw how Richard's eyes followed Elizabeth across the set even when they weren't filming. Costume designers observed how Elizabeth's entire demeanor changed when Burton entered the room, how she became simultaneously more animated and more focused, as if his presence sharpened everything around her. Between takes, the two actors would disappear into quiet corners of the massive set, engaged in conversations that seemed to block out the rest of the world. Other cast members felt like intruders when they approached. The connection between Elizabeth and Richard had created an invisible barrier that few people dared to cross. They were playing Cleopatra and Mark Antony, history's most famous doomed lovers, and the line between performance and reality was evaporating like morning mist under Roman sunshine. But here's what made the situation truly dangerous. Both Elizabeth and Richard were married to other people. Elizabeth was still legally bound to Eddie Fisher, though their relationship had become hollow months earlier, existing only in public appearances and studio photographs. Richard was married to Sybil Williams, a Welsh woman he had met during his theater days, and they had two young daughters together waiting for him at home. The affair that was developing on the Cleopatra set wasn't just unprofessional or scandalous. It was a betrayal of families, a violation of vows made before God and witnesses, and in the deeply conservative climate of the early 1960s, it was considered morally reprehensible by most of American and European society. By February 1962, their attraction had evolved into something neither could control or hide. They began meeting secretly after filming ended for the day. Rome's restaurants and quiet trattorias became their refuge from the chaos of the production. They would sit in dark corners for hours, the conversation flowing between poetry and pain, ambition and vulnerability and childhood wounds. Richard would recite Dylan Thomas in his resonant Welsh accent, his voice turning the words into something intimate and heartbreaking. Elizabeth would share stories from her wartime childhood in London, before Hollywood had claimed her and turned her into a commodity, when she was just a frightened girl watching bombs fall from the sky. They were falling in love, and everyone around them could see it happening in real time. In early March 1962, Elizabeth and Richard made a fatal miscalculation. Believing they could escape the constant surveillance of the film set, they took a boat trip on the Mediterranean with a small group of friends. It was supposed to be a private afternoon away from cameras and crew, a few hours where they could simply be two people enjoying each other's company without the crushing weight of expectation and performance. They were catastrophically wrong. Paparazzi had been following them for weeks, sensing that something newsworthy was developing, waiting for the perfect moment to capture evidence of what everyone on the Cleopatra set already knew. Photographers with telephoto lenses positioned themselves strategically along the coastline and on nearby boats. When Elizabeth and Richard, believing themselves finally alone, embraced and kissed on the yacht's deck with the Mediterranean sun behind them. Cameras captured every moment from multiple angles. The photographs hit newspapers around the world within 48 hours. The images showed two of Hollywood's biggest stars, both married to other people, locked in an embrace that left absolutely no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The scandal exploded with a force that shocked even seasoned Hollywood observers who thought they had seen everything. This wasn't a rumor or speculation that could be denied or explained away. This was photographic evidence of adultery, displayed on breakfast tables across America and Europe, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Conservative newspapers ran editorials condemning the affair. Religious leaders from multiple denominations used the scandal as evidence of Hollywood's moral decay and the dangers of secular culture. Women's groups organized campaigns against Elizabeth, calling her a destroyer of families and a threat to the institution of marriage itself. The hatred was unprecedented and unrelenting. Then something unprecedented happened. The Vatican newspaper L'Osservatore Romano published an official statement condemning the relationship. The article didn't name Elizabeth and Richard directly, but everyone in the world knew exactly who was being referenced. It called the affair erotic vagrancy and suggested it represented everything wrong with modern secular culture, a symptom of societal decay that threatened traditional values. The Vatican, which rarely commented on Hollywood matters or secular entertainment, had been moved to make a public condemnation. Elizabeth Taylor had achieved something no other actor in history had managed. She had become such a scandal that even Pope John XXIII, leader of millions of Catholics worldwide, had heard about her affair. The condemnation from religious authorities only intensified the already overwhelming media frenzy. Reporters camped outside Elizabeth's Roman villa around the clock. Every restaurant she entered became a spectacle with photographers fighting for position. Photographers followed her car through the narrow streets of Rome. The pressure was immense and crushing, and it revealed something unexpected about both Elizabeth and Richard. Neither of them backed down under the assault. Instead of apologizing or hiding or ending the relationship to save their careers, they became defiant. Elizabeth gave a memorable interview where she said, "I'm not a sinner. I just love the wrong people." Richard, when pressed by aggressive journalists outside the set, responded with Shakespeare quotes about love and fate and the impossibility of controlling the heart. Their rebellion against public judgment, their refusal to behave like chastened sinners seeking forgiveness, only made the scandal grow even bigger. While the world watched the affair unfold, 20th Century Fox watched their investment disintegrate. The Cleopatra production had already been troubled. The move from London to Rome had cost millions. Elizabeth's near-death experience had shut down filming for months. But the affair added a devastating new dimension. Director Joseph Mankiewicz later admitted controlling the set became nearly impossible. Elizabeth and Richard's emotional states fluctuated wildly. Some days they performed brilliantly. Other days they could barely function. The budget had climbed from $4 million to over $40 million, equivalent to over $300 million today. The studio was hemorrhaging cash. Insurance companies threatened to pull coverage. Fox executives held crisis sessions discussing bankruptcy. The Cleopatra disaster threatened to destroy one of Hollywood's most powerful studios. At the center of this financial apocalypse were two actors who couldn't stop touching each other. What emerged years later, Elizabeth and Richard had developed an obsessive dependence on each other. Richard drank less when Elizabeth was near. Elizabeth needed fewer pain medications when Richard was present. They were self-medicating with each other, using their connection to numb deeper wounds. This made their relationship intensely powerful and deeply unstable. Eddie Fisher watched his marriage disintegrate through newspaper photographs. He had sacrificed everything to be with Elizabeth. He flew to Rome to confront her. The conversation was brutal. She was in love with Richard Burton. Eddie returned to America alone, his career destroyed. Sybil Burton had stood by Richard through years of drinking and affairs. When the scandal broke, she initially maintained dignity. But as the affair continued, Sybil quietly began divorce proceedings. By late 1963, both divorces were finalized. Elizabeth and Richard's relationship carried the weight of destroyed families. Most affairs collapse under that pressure, but they moved forward, choosing to stay together regardless of the cost. Cleopatra reached theaters in June 1963, more than 3 years after production began. The premiere was cinema's most anticipated event, not for the film itself, but because audiences wanted to see Elizabeth and Richard together on screen, knowing what had happened behind the scenes. Fox leaned heavily into the scandal for publicity. Posters emphasized passionate scenes. Trailers highlighted their chemistry. The subtext was unmistakable. Come watch the affair that destroyed Hollywood. Critics were mixed on the film. Many found it overlong and dramatically uneven, though the costumes were spectacular and the sets overwhelming. But none of that mattered. The film became a massive box office success because of the scandal. Everyone wanted to see the chemistry that had caused such chaos. When Elizabeth and Richard shared their first kiss as Cleopatra and Antony, audiences leaned forward, knowing they were watching something real disguised as performance. Yet even substantial ticket sales couldn't immediately restore Fox's financial health after spending $40 million. The Cleopatra production had brought one of Hollywood's most powerful institutions to the brink of collapse. They married in March 1964 in Montreal. The media declared them Hollywood's most powerful couple. They bought homes in multiple countries, constantly photographed dripping with jewelry. From the outside, they had won. The reality was complicated. The intensity that brought them together amplified with marriage. Their relationship veered between profound connection and devastating arguments. Richard drank heavily. Elizabeth took prescription medications. They fought with legendary intensity, then reconciled with equal drama. Here's the revealing detail. Despite the chaos, they remained devoted for years. Richard bought Elizabeth the 69-carat Taylor-Burton diamond. Their lifestyle was excessive. Spending, drinking, fighting, loving, all at maximum intensity. They lived like Roman emperors. By 1974, both were exhausted. They divorced in June. Then something unexpected happened. 16 months later, they remarried. They couldn't stay away. The second marriage in Botswana in October 1975 was somehow more romantic. They were choosing each other again, believing love could overcome everything. It couldn't. The second marriage lasted less than a year. By July 1976, they divorced again. This time it was final. Richard died in 1984 from a cerebral hemorrhage. Elizabeth later said he was the great love of her life. The Cleopatra scandal reveals how Hollywood evolved. Before Elizabeth and Richard, studios controlled star narratives. Scandals were suppressed. But the Cleopatra affair was too big to control. The paparazzi photographs shattered the studio system's authority. Their relationship marked the end of Hollywood's golden age and the beginning of modern celebrity culture. After them, the line between public and private lives blurred permanently. The idea that movie stars were untouchable gods gave way to understanding them as talented, troubled people who made mistakes and fell in love. Elizabeth lived until 2011. She was remembered for AIDS activism and humanitarian work. She married 8 times, searching for what she felt with Richard, never finding it again. In later interviews, she was honest. Yes, the affair had been wrong. Yes, it hurt people, but she didn't regret falling in love with Richard Burton. How could she regret the greatest love of her life? The yacht photographs that scandalized 1962 now look quaint, but for people who lived through it, the Cleopatra affair remains a watershed moment. It proved movie stars were human, that love could be both beautiful and devastating, and that sometimes the greatest performances happen off camera. The Cleopatra set has long been dismantled, but the memory persists. The affair that destroyed marriages, nearly bankrupted a studio, earned Vatican condemnation, and proved that sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones we don't plan to tell.